You're watching Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. The focus for this evening will be on the global Sukuk market. Fitch Ratings last week has announced a report saying that the global Sukuk market is going to take an impact, at least in the short term. Malaysia, being a key feature in the Sukuk market, will also be impacted. How will corporates and governments raise debt, particularly when the coronavirus is impacting on the fiscal situation for various countries around the world, predominantly countries that are focused on doing sukuk like Malaysia, like the GCC, and how will this going to be impacted moving forward, at least towards the end of the year? We speak with Bashar Al Natoor, the global head of Islamic finance for Fitch Ratings. Bashar, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. Let's do a quick review of the analysis that Fitch Rating has on the global Sukuk market.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Although last time we were in the studio together, now we're doing it via video conferencing.
Which is millions, maybe not millions, but thousands of kilometers apart.
Yes. Well, hopefully things will be back as before. If we zoom to the Sukuk market, I think the interesting side of things is maybe just to give a little bit of very quickly a background. So until 2019 and before, the growth has been, I would say, healthy when it comes to the Sukuk market in markets where Sukuk and Islamic finance is active. The first 2 months actually of 2020 were also very vibrant in terms of issuance. We've seen issuance coming across the board in many of the jurisdictions where Islamic finance is active. However, when the COVID-19 started having an impact in these countries, the market, specifically the international Sukuk market, came to a standstill in March. And I'm saying international Sukuk market because there is a differentiation between the local debt market and the international debt market, which we can discuss definitely later. However, we expected at that time, and as expected, that things are going to start normalizing. And then when issuers and investors readjust and create a new stand for them, things will resume. And we've expected actually in the short to medium term, the actual impact on Sukuk to be actually positive, because the deficits in countries where Islamic finance is active, because of the COVID-19 and because of many of these being linked to oil prices, their income, actually they are impacted, and that means bigger deficits, which means bigger funding from the market, which means bigger funding from Sukuk. So this is what we've seen. And in the recent few weeks, we started seeing the comeback as expected. So we've seen multilaterals, we've seen sovereigns like Indonesia, we've seen banks coming to the market with Sukuk issuances. And I think this trend will continue. Usually we have a quiet summer for Sukuk, but I think summer this year is going to be, again, hot and vibrant.
You know, Bashar, you've touched on so many things I want to ask. Let's go line by line. Right now, borrowing needs are going to rise. Countries like Malaysia has issued large economic stimulus. We have the need to borrow, and Malaysia is not the only one. Indonesia is doing the same. GCC countries are doing the same, and large oil faults are going to impact net oil exporters, people like Malaysia, people like GCC. Do you think that because of this, there is a huge demand for Sukuk to take place during the summer, as you say? But what about the pricing then? Would it increase because of the risk, because of the various denominations that we have, or would issuing a particular denomination would price some of the Sukuk to be cheaper? What's the story like for countries like Malaysia and GCC, where the net oil exporters are going to be impacted by this $35 per barrel kind of situation?
Okay, there is, even in your question, there is multi-dimension. So for countries like Malaysia, for example, where they have a vibrant local market, is different than, so Malaysia and Saudi, they have a deep, to some extent Saudi, a deep local market that they can actually tap into. Where in other countries, you don't have that option. The international one, it has a broader perspective. So you need, when you are looking at raising funds, you will see first countries are going to be going to local and international, or to international only because they don't have a local one, or tapping only to the local one more than the international one. So it is very important to segregate between markets. The ones that have developed local currency market, they have a different type of investors with a different type of risk that can actually come to their rescue. I mean, if you look at Malaysia, for example, more than 60% of issuance in the debt market is actually in Sukuk. So they have a really established, evolved Sukuk market where they can tap into. But Malaysia did not tap into the international market recently when it comes to Sukuk. And that is something that you need to bear in mind. You look at Saudi Arabia, they actually, even in March, they were able to tap significantly in their Saudi Riyal local market. And they did not tap yet into the Sukuk market, but what they did is they tapped in the bond market. So the options is going to be bonds, Sukuk, local, and international. And the more that you have the combination, because you have different risk and investor pools. So this is on one dimension. We said oil prices, COVID-19, more funding need on one hand. On the other hand, the interest rate has went down. So even the international investors and their appetite to emerging market where Sukuk is actually is located, because Sukuk is in the emerging market, the appetite of investors and their search for yield is something that you need to watch. So it's not just one dimension, there is this dimension, and they need at the end of the day to invest money. The third option is the liquidity in the systems and in the local market. So there is a lot of things that can go in favor or not in the favor of the actual Sukuk. Now, pricing is not, it's not going to be one thing. You will find some cases where Sukuk is going to be priced at a similar price of bonds. You will find some cases where it's cheaper because you're really tapping in an investor pool, and your investor pool is really dominated by Islamic investors where they're willing, they can only buy Sukuk. And you'll have, so it's not like a fixed case where it's going to be either higher or lower. I think we will see all three happening.
Okay, fantastic. So that does bring about the question of the type of investors that might want to come into the picture right now. As you say, interest rates are near zero across various countries, including that of Malaysia. We want to understand the kind of thinking that the investors might have to put through when they want to tap the local market per se. I understand the matrix that you illustrated just now, bond, Sukuk, local, international, lovely matrix to have. What would be some of the key considerations that investors are looking forward in the near term when they think about, say for instance, domestic Sukuk market, something like Ringgit, Malaysia market?
I think, I mean, when you talk about local market and local issuances, the investor appetite and the sophistication of the investors and the interest of the investor changes. Because if you're talking about the international market, US dollar, then they're not taking currency risk. They're taking the risk of the issuer rather than the issuer and the currency and legislation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you're talking about a local market, I think you will find that a significant part of that is actually local. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, it's the local banks. In Malaysia, you have investment funds, you have Hajj funds, you have banks, and you have issuers that buy in the local market. So for them, they're not taking currency risk. For them, they're comfortable with the sovereign risk, for example, if that's a sovereign. And even if it's a corporate, they're more familiar with it. If you're tapping into the international market, then you're talking to an international investor. And their category is risk, return, and liquidity position. So at the end of the day, I think these three factors, on top of many other factors, will be key for determining them tapping into the international market and the ones that have some experience. So this is where if you have an established local market with track record and tested will play in your favor because they know the market, they're familiar with it, then they're easier to access it if they are comfortable with it. Where if you don't have one and you want to establish one in these times, I think it's going to be more difficult and it will take more time. So I think this is what the key aspects to look for.
You don't think this is the time for countries to explore, countries that have not been in the Sukuk market to explore the domestic market just yet? You think that now is not the time for it? Maybe sometime next year or so on, because of the global financial situation right now being as volatile as it is?
No, I'm saying what the ones that established, they can bear the fruit. The ones that are not establishing, they will establish. And the thing is, when you're establishing a local market, your targeted investor base is actually local, which is your banks, for example, which is going to be there. But your question was, am I going to see international investors tapping into the local market? And I think that is something that will follow. So you need to start building a track record, put the right policies, infrastructure, have your local investors, and then the international one. But if you start with local and expect international investors to be a big part of your investment pool, that is usually not the case.
Okay, the first 2 months of this year saw issuances at a normal, rate, but everything dropped to near zero around March and I think April as well. But now it's starting to pick up. What would be some of the forecasting that you can share with us throughout the rest of the year? Will it be as vibrant as the years before, or we're still going to see some dip because of the slowdown in the second quarter?
We've already started seeing sovereigns like Bahrain, and I said you will see that there is other sovereigns from Asia coming to the market. So I think comparing it to last year is unfair. You might see, so I mean, for many reasons, obviously, but I think what is more important is on the medium term. So if we don't look just at these 12 months of 2020, is this going to have a positive or a negative impact on the volume of Sukuk? And the answers, I think, is yes, it's going to have a positive impact because the funding needs are there. So you need to fund more gaps in your fiscal deficits through funding, which is in these countries means and will translate to Sukuk. So I would say if we don't focus on is it going to be more or less in 2020, although you might actually get, because of the vibrant summer, you might get to the same levels of 2020 or maybe even higher or even lower. But at the end of the day, if you disregard this year of 2020 and just look a little bit beyond, the story is going to be positive for terms of Sukuk volumes and issuances. And it's not only on the sovereign side, because I think this is an important thing that I did not maybe mention. Usually in Malaysia, yes, you have a vibrant corporate Sukuk market also. In many of the other countries, actually, the corporates are not really to the actual potential. But because of the funding pressures on the sovereigns and the reserves, which is translating to more pressure on the bank's liquidity, which is the main source of funding of corporates, you might find these corporates, or at least tier one corporates, diversifying their funding and tapping in the market. So it's not only the sovereigns and financial institutions and the corporates that you see. You actually will still, you might see a need of many of the corporates, specifically in the GCC, that have always relied on banks, now saying, okay, there is tighter liquidity, we need to diversify and see more Sukuk. And that is another factor that actually could help the volumes in other countries. Why am I excluding Malaysia? Because you already have an established Sukuk market locally where corporates can actually tap into.
No, that's absolutely right, because we've seen Malaysian corporates issuing Sukuk for the longest of time, but GCC, they're slow on the uptake unless it's sovereign. And because of this, do you think that that diversification of funding sources is going to be a real question for the corporates, at least in the GCC, to think about right now? And if so, what kind of corporates, when you say tier one, do you think that some sectors might be more, I guess, open to the idea of issuing debt, or do you think that it's going to be across the board, at least for the tier one type of corporates in the GCC?
Tier one, when I say it, I'm linking it to the credit story. Because if you are trying to attract investors and you are someone that is new to the market, you need to have a credit story that is acceptable for investors. Specifically, if you're talking about international investors. So if you're tapping to your local investors, in many of these countries, it's actually the banks, to be very honest. So you can get a loan for it. But if you want to really broaden your investor base and diversify your funding, you need to have a good credit story that is acceptable for the international investors. And this is where the question comes. And this is where I say you'll start seeing investors, okay, do I have comfort in the risk that I am taking toward that company and the return that I'm going to get? And in that, then you start that transforming into tier one and tier two, and I'm comfortable with this one, I don't know this company, I'm not happy with the story. Where in other countries, if you have, again, as I said, a local capital market, the investors in the local market are closer to these corporates and know them better. And that makes this credit story for them known and thus easier to invest in.
All right, Bashar, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more on the ongoings of the Sukuk market. Don't go anywhere.